The autumn of 1843 descended upon Willow Creek, Virginia, with a chill that seemed to seep not merely into the bones, but into the very spirit of the small, isolated community. Nestled deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains, Willow Creek was a place where old ways clung like morning mist, and whispers carried more weight than printed words. It was a town of weathered timber homes and a single, stern-faced church, where the congregation knew each other's histories and secrets by heart. Yet, even in this familiar landscape, an unsettling mystery began to take root, one that would defy explanation and haunt the memories of those who witnessed it. At the heart of this unfolding enigma was the Willow Creek Orphanage, a stone edifice that stood sentinel on a gentle rise, overlooking the winding creek from which the town drew its name. For decades, it had served as a refuge for the lost and forgotten, its plain wooden doors a silent testament to lives touched by tragedy. Matron Eleanor Vance, a woman of unyielding piety and practical disposition, oversaw its daily rhythms, her days a tireless devotion to the dozen or so children under her care. It was a life of routine, of chores and prayers, of simple meals and quiet evenings, a predictable existence meant to offer solace in a world that often offered none. Among the children, however, there was one who was anything but ordinary, a girl named Elara. She had arrived at the orphanage 2 years prior, a silent, wide-eyed waif brought by a circuit rider who claimed to have found her abandoned on the outskirts of Lynchburg. Her origins were shrouded in mystery, her past a blank slate that even Matron Vance's persistent inquiries could not fill. Elara was remarkable not for her beauty, though she possessed a delicate grace, but for an unusual quietude and an intensity in her gaze that spoke of an old soul trapped in a child's frame. Elara's days were spent in quiet observation, her small hands often clasped in her lap as she watched the other children at play, rarely joining in their boisterous games. She excelled at her lessons, absorbing scripture and arithmetic with an uncommon ease, yet her intelligence seemed to reside in a realm beyond the practical. It was her nights, however, that truly set her apart, and it was in the hushed darkness of the dormitory that the strange phenomenon began to manifest. A series of occurrences that would soon cast a long, unsettling shadow over Willow Creek. The first whispers began among the older girls, who shared the dormitory with Elara. They spoke of odd sounds emanating from Elara's cot in the dead of night, not the usual childish murmurs or restless turning, but something far more peculiar. It was a soft, rhythmic cadence, a flow of syllables unlike any they had ever heard. The girls, initially intrigued, soon found themselves chilled by the unfamiliarity of the sounds, a growing unease settling upon them as the nights wore on. It was Martha, one of the older and more observant orphans, who finally dared to approach Matron Vance with her concerns, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. She recounted the strange nocturnal utterances of Elara. "Matron," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Elara, she speaks in her sleep, but it's not English, it's a different tongue." Matron Vance, ever the skeptic of youthful fancy, dismissed it as a child's vivid imagination, perhaps a forgotten nursery rhyme in a foreign language from some distant memory Elara might possess. However, the reports persisted, growing more frequent and more detailed. Other girls corroborated Martha's account, describing the distinct rhythm and foreign inflection of Elara's nocturnal speech. They spoke of how the sound seemed to carry an ancient resonance, a weight that belied the child from whom they came. The children, usually prone to exaggeration, seemed genuinely disquieted, their small faces pale in the morning light. Their collective testimony began to chip away at Matron Vance's pragmatic resolve, sowing a seed of doubt in her otherwise unshakable mind. One evening, unable to ignore the mounting reports, Matron Vance decided to witness the phenomenon for herself. She took up a silent vigil in the corner of the dormitory after the children had fallen asleep, the only light a sliver of moonbeam filtering through the tall, narrow windows. The air was heavy with the quiet breathing of the sleeping orphans, the familiar sounds of the old building settling around her. Hours passed in silent anticipation, and for a time, she wondered if the children had been mistaken, or if Elara's strange nocturnal habit had simply ceased. Then, just as the moon climbed higher, painting the floorboards in silver, a low murmur emanated from Elara's cot. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, a gentle ripple in the otherwise profound stillness. Matron Vance strained to hear, her heart beginning to beat a little faster within her chest. The murmuring grew, gaining a measured cadence, a flow of distinct sounds. It was unmistakably a language, yet one utterly unknown to her. The syllables were crisp, precise, almost musical, possessing an archaic elegance that sent a shiver down her spine. Matron Vance, a woman educated beyond the typical scope for her time, had a rudimentary understanding of several European languages, gleaned from dusty old texts in the orphanage's small library. But this was different. This language felt ancient, profound, utterly alien to her ear. It was not the slurred, indistinct babbling of a restless sleeper, but a clear, articulate stream of words. The child, lying perfectly still in her bed, her small face serene in the moonlight, seemed to be speaking with a precision that was unsettling in its perfection. The sound continued for several minutes, a hypnotic drone that filled the silent room, before gradually fading into silence once more. Matron Vance remained frozen, a knot of bewilderment and apprehension tightening in her stomach. She had witnessed it, undeniable and inexplicable. The child, Elara, spoke in her sleep, not in the ramblings of a dream, but in a structured, coherent language that belonged to another time, another world. The implications of what she had heard began to weigh heavily upon her, a dark and perplexing burden. The following morning, Matron Vance found herself in a state of profound disquiet. The logical explanations she usually relied upon crumbled in the face of what she had heard. She was a woman of faith, certainly, but also a woman of reason, and this phenomenon defied all reason. Her first instinct was to consult the one man in Willow Creek who possessed a broader knowledge of the world beyond their valley, Reverend Elijah Thorne. The Reverend was a scholarly man, having spent years at a seminary before taking up his post in the quiet mountain town, his small personal library filled with obscure volumes and ancient texts. Reverend Thorne listened intently as Matron Vance recounted the events of the previous night, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man of quiet demeanor and sharp intellect, rarely surprised by the eccentricities of human nature. But the matron's tale gave him pause. He recognized the sincerity in her voice, the genuine bewilderment in her eyes. The idea of a child speaking an unknown tongue in her sleep was certainly extraordinary, bordering on the inexplicable. He agreed to visit the orphanage that very evening, determined to hear the strange phenomenon for himself. That night, the Reverend and Matron Vance sat in hushed vigil, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of a single lantern placed strategically away from the sleeping children. The silence of the dormitory felt different this time, charged with an almost palpable anticipation. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity as they waited for the strange nocturnal chorus to begin. The air grew heavy, the anticipation thick, and the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping children filled the otherwise quiet space. Just after midnight, it began. A soft, almost whispered cadence emerged from Elara's cot, gradually rising in volume and clarity. Reverend Thorne leaned forward, his ears straining to catch every syllable. The sounds were indeed distinct, a language he vaguely recognized from his seminary studies, a language of ancient texts and forgotten rituals. His eyes widened slightly as the truth dawned upon him, a truth both astonishing and deeply unsettling. The cadence, the very structure of the phrases, confirmed his growing suspicion. "Latin," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, turning to Matron Vance, his face etched with a mixture of awe and profound concern. "She is speaking Latin. Not the ecclesiastical Latin of our services, but something older, more classical, perhaps even poetic." He listened for a few more minutes, his scholarly mind attempting to parse the meaning from the flowing stream of words, but it was too rapid, too nuanced for a casual understanding. The revelation hung heavy in the air, a profound mystery now given a name. The discovery only deepened the enigma surrounding Elara. How could an abandoned orphan child with no known education or exposure to classical studies speak a dead language with such fluency and precision in her sleep? The Reverend, a man who sought logic and order in the world, found himself confronted with a phenomenon that defied all his accumulated knowledge. The whispers among the children now seemed less like childish fear and more like prescient warning. The revelation of Elara speaking Latin in her sleep cast a long shadow over the Willow Creek Orphanage. Matron Vance and Reverend Thorne found themselves at a loss, their usual methods of reasoning proving utterly inadequate. They spent hours in hushed conversations, poring over old books in the Reverend's library, seeking any mention of similar occurrences, any explanation, no matter how remote. They found none that truly fit the chilling clarity and coherence of Elara's nocturnal utterances. Reverend Thorne, driven by both intellectual curiosity and a growing sense of spiritual disquiet, made several more visits to the dormitory. He even brought a small, worn Latin dictionary, attempting to decipher fragments of Elara's nocturnal speech. What he managed to piece together were disjointed phrases, often poetic, sometimes philosophical, concerning nature, solitude, and ancient pathways. There were no discernible patterns of demonic incantation or curses, no dark pronouncements, which somewhat eased their initial, unspoken fears of a more malevolent influence. Yet, the very lack of a sinister agenda made it all the more baffling. Why Latin? Why Elara? The child herself remained oblivious to her nocturnal displays, waking each morning with the same quiet demeanor, her eyes holding the same distant quality. When questioned gently about dreams or strange sounds, she would merely shake her head, her small face unmarred by any memory of the strange linguistic ballet that unfolded from her lips each night. Her waking hours were marked by a profound silence, a stark contrast to her verbose sleeping self. The other orphans, though still wary, began to grow accustomed to Elara's nightly recitations. They no longer spoke of it with wide-eyed terror, but rather with a resigned curiosity, as if Elara's unique affliction was just another oddity in their already unusual lives. Matron Vance tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, ensuring the daily routines continued unbroken. But an undercurrent of tension now permeated the orphanage, an unspoken apprehension about the mystery residing within their walls. Reverend Thorne, in his quiet desperation, even corresponded with a former seminary colleague in Richmond, a man renowned for his knowledge of ancient languages and obscure historical phenomena. He carefully crafted a letter, omitting any overtly sensational details, simply describing a case of somnambulism coupled with complex linguistic expression. The reply was swift but offered little comfort. Such a phenomenon, if truly as described, was unprecedented in any scholarly or medical text the colleague had ever encountered. The answer, if it existed, was not to be found in books. The days bled into weeks, and the autumn winds grew colder, stripping the leaves from the trees around Willow Creek. The Latin continued, a nightly serenade of a forgotten tongue, each syllable a reminder of the profound, inexplicable mystery that had taken root within their humble orphanage. The more they learned, the less they understood, and the silence of the waking Elara only deepened the enigma, leaving Matron Vance and Reverend Thorne feeling increasingly isolated in their bewildered vigil. As winter settled its icy grip upon Willow Creek, the phenomenon surrounding Elara began to subtly, almost imperceptibly shift. The Latin spoken in her sleep grew not necessarily louder, but somehow more resonant, as if the very air around her absorbed the ancient syllables. Reverend Thorne, during his increasingly frequent nighttime vigils, noticed a change in the cadence, a slight increase in urgency, or perhaps a narrative quality emerging from the disjointed phrases. It was as if a story, fragmented and obscured, was slowly attempting to tell itself through her lips. The Reverend, armed with a better understanding of Elara's particular Latin dialect, managed to decipher more of the nightly monologues. He discovered recurring words: silver, forest, flumen, river, umbra, shadow, domus, home, and most disturbingly, solitudo, solitude or wilderness. The phrases often spoke of journeys, of being lost, of ancient trees and flowing waters. It was the language of a deeply personal odyssey, yet one told in a tongue that should have been utterly foreign to her. The narrative, though still fragmented, hinted at a deeper connection to the natural world, a journey through a landscape that felt both real and mythical. Matron Vance, though less skilled in linguistics, noticed a change in Elara's waking hours as well. The child, while still quiet, seemed to withdraw even further into herself. Her gaze often drifted to the windows, to the dense, snow-laden woods that surrounded Willow Creek, as if searching for something unseen. She would hum soft, tuneless melodies that none of the other children recognized, ancient-sounding refrains that carried an echo of the Latin she spoke in her sleep. It was a subtle transformation, easily missed by the casual observer, but profoundly unsettling to those who watched her closely. The other children, once merely curious, now regarded Elara with a mixture of apprehension and an almost reverent awe. They would keep a respectful distance, their games growing quieter in her presence. The younger ones, prone to vivid imaginations, began to tell hushed stories of Elara's secret language, weaving tales of hidden knowledge and ancient spirits. Matron Vance tried to quell these fanciful notions, but the mystery was too potent, too deeply rooted to be easily dismissed. The orphanage, once a simple refuge, now felt touched by something arcane. One frigid evening, as a blizzard raged outside, blanketing the valley in a thick shroud of white, Elara's sleep-talking intensified. Her voice, though still soft, carried an undeniable urgency, the Latin flowing faster, punctuated by what sounded like faint gasps. Reverend Thorne, shivering despite the roaring fire in the hearth, frantically scribbled notes, attempting to capture every word. He distinctly heard phrases about the path concealed, the light fading, and a repeated mournful cry of "Adsum non, I am not here." The air in the dormitory felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. Matron Vance, clutching her rosary, felt a cold dread settle in her heart. It was as if the ancient words were not merely being spoken, but were actively seeking something, calling out into the swirling darkness of the winter night. The quiet intensification was not a sign of the phenomenon fading, but rather of its deepening, pulling Elara further into its inexplicable grasp, away from the familiar world of Willow Creek. As the snows began to melt and the first tentative signs of spring emerged in Willow Creek, a palpable sense of unease settled over the orphanage. Elara's nightly Latin became increasingly focused, her dreamlike narrative more coherent, always hinting at a journey, a path, and a destination. Reverend Thorne, through painstaking effort, began to discern a recurring theme, a search for something lost, something ancient and hidden within the earth. The words painted a picture of forgotten trails, of stones imbued with old power, and of a profound connection to the silent, enduring land. What truly disturbed Matron Vance and Reverend Thorn, however, was not just the content of Elara's nocturnal utterances, but the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in her behavior during her waking hours. She would often stand by the windows, her gaze fixed on the dense woods beyond the orphanage grounds, a faraway look in her eyes. Her quietude deepened, becoming less like shyness and more like a profound detachment from her surroundings. It was as if a part of her was already elsewhere, responding to an unseen call. The Reverend noticed that on certain nights, particularly those with a full moon, Elara's Latin was more fervent, more charged with an almost desperate energy. He tried to speak to her about her dreams, to gently probe her memories, but Elara would only offer a blank stare, a polite but firm silence that conveyed nothing. Her small, delicate frame seemed almost translucent at times, as if she were slowly fading, becoming less tethered to the tangible world. Her pallor grew more pronounced, and her appetite, never robust, diminished further. One afternoon, Matron Vance found Elara sketching intently on a discarded piece of paper. It wasn't a childish drawing of flowers or animals, but an intricate, detailed map. It depicted meandering lines that resembled paths, shaded areas that could be forests, and curious symbols that seemed to mark specific locations. At the center of the drawing was a cluster of shapes that vaguely resembled standing stones, or perhaps ancient markers, surrounded by a swirling pattern that evoked both water and shadow. When asked about it, Elara merely looked up, a fleeting expression of something akin to longing in her eyes, before quickly folding the paper and tucking it away. The atmosphere in the orphanage grew heavy with unspoken fears. The children, sensing the adults' apprehension, became more subdued. Their whispers about Elara now carried a note of sadness rather than just fear. They instinctively understood that something profound was happening, something beyond their comprehension that was slowly drawing their quiet companion away. The feeling was akin to watching a fragile bird prepare for an impossible flight, knowing it might never return. Reverend Thorn felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand before it was too late. The Latin was no longer just a linguistic curiosity. It felt like a countdown, a narrative unfolding towards an unknown, inevitable conclusion. The unseen pull on Elara was becoming undeniable, a subtle but relentless force guiding her towards a destiny whispered in a forgotten tongue, away from the sheltering walls of the Willow Creek Orphanage. The night of Elara's vanishing was cold and still, the air pregnant with the unspoken dread that had settled over Willow Creek. A sliver of moon hung low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the orphanage grounds. Inside, Matron Vance and Reverend Thorn maintained their weary vigil, their faces etched with fatigue and growing apprehension. Elara's Latin had intensified over the past few days, her nocturnal utterances taking on a compelling, almost hypnotic rhythm. The fragments Reverend Thorn managed to translate spoke repeatedly of the calling, the threshold, and the journey's end. That evening, Elara's sleep-talking was unlike any they had heard before. Her voice, though still soft, carried an astonishing clarity, each Latin syllable perfectly articulated, resonating with a strange, profound authority. It was no longer a child's voice speaking in dreams, but a vessel for something ancient and powerful. The words flowed in a continuous stream, a lyrical narrative that spoke of an ancient path revealed, of Earth's hidden secrets, and of a return to a place known only to the oldest stones. Reverend Thorn frantically scribbled, his hand barely keeping pace with the rapid flow of words. He caught phrases about the forgotten stream, the marked stone, and the silent guardian. There was a deep sadness in the tone, but also an undeniable sense of purpose, of an inevitable conclusion to a long, unseen pilgrimage. Matron Vance, though unable to understand the words, felt the chilling power of the language, the air around Elara seeming to shimmer with an almost ethereal energy. A profound sense of loss began to settle upon her, a premonition that clutched at her heart. As the Latin reached a crescendo, a final lingering phrase echoed through the silent dormitory, "Iter ad domum meum," which Reverend Thorne translated as "my journey home." And then an abrupt silence fell. It was not the gradual fading that usually occurred, but an instantaneous cessation, as if a switch had been flicked. The air, which moments before had felt charged, now seemed thin and empty. A profound stillness descended, more unsettling than any sound. Matron Vance, her heart pounding, rose slowly and walked towards Elara's cot. The other children were still asleep, their breathing light and rhythmic. She reached the bedside, her hand hovering over the small form under the thin blanket. The bed was empty. The blanket lay undisturbed, precisely as she had left it earlier, neatly tucked in around the impression of where a small body should have been. There was no disarray, no sign of struggle, no indication of how a child could have simply vanished from a tightly secured room. A gasp escaped Matron Vance's lips, quickly stifled by a hand pressed to her mouth. Reverend Thorne was instantly by her side, his eyes widening in disbelief as he, too, saw the empty cot. The window was latched from the inside, the door firmly bolted. There was no logical explanation. Elara, the orphan who spoke Latin in her sleep, had simply ceased to be there, as if the ancient words had conjured her away, leading her on that final journey home that her Latin had so compellingly described. The disappearance of Elara sent a ripple of profound shock and fear through the small community of Willow Creek. The meticulously searched orphanage, the surrounding woods, the creek banks, every conceivable hiding place was combed by the townsfolk and a hastily assembled search party. They called out her name, their voices echoing hollowly through the still, cold air, but only the wind answered. No footprints were found in the soft earth, no scrap of clothing snagged on a branch, no trace of a small child who had simply ceased to exist. Matron Vance, though heartbroken, remained steadfast in her conviction that Elara had not simply run away. There was no logical means of egress, no earthly reason for her to abandon the only home she had known. The empty cot, the undisturbed bed, the perfectly latched window, these were silent witnesses to an impossibility. Reverend Thorne, equally bewildered, spoke quietly of the Latin, of the recurring themes of journeys and hidden paths, but even he struggled to articulate the full, unsettling implications of what they had witnessed. The most plausible explanation defied all earthly understanding. The authorities from Lynchburg, summoned by the Reverend, arrived days later, their cynicism palpable. They spoke of runaways, of wild animals, of unfortunate accidents in the rugged terrain. But the people of Willow Creek knew better. They had witnessed the strange phenomenon, heard the unearthly tongue, and felt the chilling atmosphere that had settled over their valley. The officials, after a cursory and fruitless search, eventually departed, leaving behind a community grappling with an enigma that would forever remain unsolved. A silent void where a child once lay. In the years that followed, the memory of Elara became a haunting legend in Willow Creek. The orphanage continued its work, but a quiet reverence, almost a fear, clung to the dormitory where she had slept. The children who had witnessed her Latin recitations grew older, their memories vivid, though often colored by the passage of time. They would tell their own children and grandchildren the tale of the quiet orphan girl who spoke in a voice not her own, and then one night simply vanished as if spirited away by the very words she uttered. Occasionally, deep in the surrounding woods, hikers or hunters would report strange occurrences. a fleeting glimpse of a small, pale figure disappearing among the ancient trees, a whisper of unfamiliar words carried on the wind, or the sound of an ancient melody, faint and melancholic, emanating from the deepest parts of the forest. These were dismissed as trick of light and sound, products of overactive imaginations in a wild landscape. But for those in Willow Creek, these whispers were an echo of Elara, a testament to her lingering presence. The mystery of Elara, the orphan who spoke Latin in her sleep and then vanished, became an enduring part of Willow Creek's folklore. A tale whispered around hearths on cold winter nights, it served as a stark reminder of the inexplicable, of the vast, unknown forces that sometimes brush against the edges of the human world. Her disappearance left a scar on the heart of the community, a profound question mark that hung forever in the air, a haunting melody of an ancient tongue carried on the mountain winds, forever seeking its way home. If you like this type of stories, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.